All right, so our last lesson is on biodiversity. It's actually one of my favorite topics because it's one that is heavily researched and is actually one of the areas of study that I am doing for my master's degree. So biodiversity refers to the sum total of the variety of organisms in the biosphere. It can be measured in several ways. So the first way is ecosystem diversity, and that refers to just the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes in the living world. And then you can also measure it with species diversity, which refers to the number of different species in the biosphere. And then you can also measure it with genetic diversity, which just refers to the sum total of all the different forms of genetic information carried by all of the organisms living on Earth today. Biodiversity is very important just for the health of the overall ecosystem. It's one of the greatest natural resources on Earth. So the many different species on Earth have provided humans with food, industrial products, and medicines. Plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria have provided painkillers, antibiotics, heart drugs, antidepressants, and cancer medicines for us to use. So biodiversity is very important so that we can have all of that diversity of function and use. Without biodiversity, we wouldn't have that. And a good, healthy ecosystem does have biodiversity in it. So that's kind of how you measure it. You see more biodiversity as you get closer to the equator because there's more species that can handle the tropical environment than the cold, so there's just more that are adapted to it. But biodiversity is an important part of a healthy ecosystem. So scientists have estimated that there are at least 10 million species on Earth today. Of those, about 1.5 million of them have been identified and named. So if you guys are still wanting to go into ecology or biological sciences, you could still potentially discover a new species and name it. There's also a lot of research being done in bacteriology, because there's just a lot of bacteria that we don't know about. They're more numerous than any animal kingdom that we have. And then if you want to really make sure that you discover something new, viruses, there are billions of them out there that we have not discovered, named, whatever. There's a vast ocean that we haven't even explored. It's still a science that we're constantly learning new things. It is estimated that 20% of existing species may vanish by 2030. And that kind of makes sense because right now we are currently going through a lot of extinctions, or mass extinctions. So it is kind of hypothesized by ecologists that the humans are going to cause the next big mass extinction where things are just going to sort of disappear because of the selective pressures that we're putting on it, whether it be we hunt it too much or that we destroy too much of its habitat. So basically what we do as humans impacts the extinction rate right now. It's just something that we have to consider when we are changing the environment around us. When biodiversity is lost, potential sources of compounds and materials that could be valuable to humans and the biosphere are lost forever. We are not going to get those species back. The processes that it took to create that species, the evolutionary process, is not going to repeat itself within our lifetimes, within several lifetimes, because it's a very slow, gradual process that makes all of these different species. So when you wipe one out, it is gone forever. It does not come back. How do humans affect biodiversity? There are, a few ways. One that I've mentioned before is habitat destruction. So when we come in and we build our buildings, parking lots, any human structure, we are taking away habitat from the animals that live there, We are also doing the same thing when we cut down forests for agriculture. We are taking away the habitat for those animals that lived in those forests. So every time we change our environment to fit us, we are impacting and destroying the habitat of other species. And then we have also done the hunting species to extinction. And that is just because we've done it with overfishing. We have done it to the buffalo. Those things were overhunted to near extinction. There were like 33 left, and then they have repopulated what we now know as our bison, or our bison population in Montana today and in Yellowstone National Park. So that's an example where we came pretty close to losing that resource. Currently, though, we have like laws and rules in place with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, where they limit the amount of game animals that you can kill, and that's so that you can maintain the population and continue to do that year after year. So there is ways of sustainably hunting species, but we have made a lot of mistakes as humans, and we have hunted species to the point of extinction on multiple occasions. Another thing that humans do to impact diversity is we introduce toxic chemicals into the environment, or toxic compounds into food webs. So when we are spraying pesticides on crops, or fertilizers, whatever, those chemicals can be washed down through erosion into rivers and streams and affect fish populations. The birds eat the fish, then it affects the bird's population and just moves through the food web that way. It happened with DDT when we were trying to kill off all those mosquitoes, and then it made the eggshells really soft for the birds of prey, and it dropped their populations drastically. Luckily, we figured it out and caught on and stopped using it, and those populations have been able to recover. But that is one impact that we have on the environment. And then lastly, number 4, introducing foreign species into a new environment. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because we actually have a lot of cases of that, especially in Montana's lakes and streams. So what happens is humans are like, I like fishing here, but I want to catch this very specific fish because I like this fish more than the others. So they take a bunch of fish and they transport them to the lake and they release them in there so that when they're fishing, they can catch the type of fish that they want. And what happens is that changes the dynamics of the ecosystem and the predator-prey relationships and the food sources and the availability of food. And so you change the ecosystem, and then maybe that fish that you introduce becomes a dominant species, and those native species start to die out because they just can't compete. So that's one way that we do it. In fact, Flathead Lake is a great example of this. It used to have a lot of salmon and kokanee salmon, and now it's dominated by 2 other fish species that were introduced later into the lake. We've also done it where we've had a weed that we really wanted to get rid of, or a pest that we really wanted to get rid of. So we're like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to introduce this species that eats it, and that will solve our problems. But what we didn't think about was what problems that new species we just introduced were going to cause. And so ecologists today are actually more aware of that. So when they're trying to get rid of a weed, they're like, okay, if we introduce this species, how is it going to affect the rest of the ecosystem? But it's not something that we really considered before. So we have wiped out species just because we've been trying to get rid of one specific one, and then we ended up affecting an entire ecosystem by introducing a new species into it to get rid of the one thing. Keystone species would be related to this topic just because a keystone species is one of those species that it's critical to the functioning of the ecosystem in which it lives because it affects the survival and abundance of many other species in the community. One example of a keystone species is a population of sea otters off the Pacific coast. So what we did with the sea otters is we hunted them to near extinction. Once again, we figured it out and stopped, but So sea otters play an important ecological role. They feed off of sea urchins. And sea urchins feed off of giant kelp that forms the basis of underwater forest communities. So when we hunted sea otters to near extinction, the sea urchins increased in number and overfed the kelp. So because we didn't have that sea otter anymore, we had an explosion of sea urchins because they didn't have a predator, and they depleted their own food supply, the kelp. So entire kelp communities just begin to disappear. So all of the biodiversity that came with those kelp was lost just because it was being overfed on by sea urchins. So it impacted that entire ecosystem. So eventually, we figured it out and we protected the sea otters from hunting, and then the kelp forest communities did recover. So because we had the foresight to see that we were hunting the sea otters to extinction, and it was impacting the environment, we actually managed to save the biodiversity of those species. So sea otters are a keystone species because they affect the survival of many other species in a community. Extinction of keystone species have serious effects on ecosystems. So if you get rid of one species, it can cascade throughout the whole ecosystem, and it can be very detrimental. So the last thing I want to talk about is extinction. And extinction occurs when a species disappears from all or part of its range. And then the difference, like an endangered species, is a species whose population is declining in a way that it places in danger of becoming extinct. And as a population declines in numbers, it loses genetic diversity. And we talked about this with the cheetahs when we were doing evolution. It loses genetic diversity, and it makes a species even more vulnerable to extinction. So when it's put on the endangered species list, it doesn't look too good because there's already been a huge loss of genetic diversity, and it increases the risk of that species going extinct. And that is all.